The year is 1858. Savannah, Georgia stands as a jewel of the antebellum South, its grand mansions rising from streets lined with Spanish moss and secrets. But beneath the elegance of its ballrooms and the prosperity of its cotton trade lies a truth that few dare acknowledge. The entire system is built on a foundation of human bondage, and that foundation is beginning to crack. This is the story of two people who should never have met as equals. One held all the power that law and society could bestow. The other possessed nothing, not even ownership of their own body. Yet when desperation and genius collided in the suffocating heat of a Georgian summer, they would forge an alliance so dangerous that discovery would mean death for one and utter ruin for the other. This is the story of Catherine Hartwell and the man she knew only as Solomon. This is the story of the heiress and the hidden ledger. Catherine Hartwell had never expected to inherit Ashford Hall. The plantation had been in her family for 3 generations, passing from father to son with the certainty of seasons. But yellow fever cares nothing for tradition or expectation. In the span of 6 terrible weeks in the summer of 1857, it took her father, her 2 brothers, and her uncle, leaving Catherine, at 24 years old, the sole heir to 1,200 acres, a crumbling mansion, and 143 human beings held in bondage. The gentlemen of Savannah society made their position clear from the moment the will was read. A woman could not manage a plantation. A woman lacked the constitution for such responsibility, the hardness required to maintain discipline over enslaved workers, the business acumen to navigate the complexities of cotton markets and credit arrangements. They offered to help her, of course. Judge Thaddeus Crowley made a particularly generous offer to purchase Ashford Hall at what he assured her was a fair price, allowing her to retire to Charleston with enough money to live modestly until she found a suitable husband. Catherine declined, not out of confidence in her abilities, but out of stubborn pride and the deep, gnawing suspicion that Judge Crowley's offer was far less generous than he claimed. She would prove them wrong. She would make Ashford Hall profitable again and show these pompous men that a Hartwell daughter was worth 10 of their sons. But pride, as Catherine would discover, is a poor substitute for knowledge. The first few months passed in a fog of overwhelming responsibility. She rose before dawn to walk the fields, observing the work gangs, noting the condition of the cotton plants, trying to project an authority she did not feel. The overseer, a cruel-faced man named Garrett who had served her father for 15 years, assured her that everything was proceeding as it should. The cotton would be abundant this year. The debts would be paid. There was nothing to worry about. Catherine wanted to believe him, but the ledgers told a different story. She had found them in her father's study, thick volumes bound in leather, filled with columns of figures in her father's precise hand. Income and expenses, crop yields and market prices, births and deaths recorded with the same clinical detachment as the purchase of farming equipment. She had never looked at these books while her father was alive. It would have been unseemly, unfeminine. Now, sitting alone in the study that still smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco, she forced herself to decipher their meaning. What she found made her blood run cold. Ashford Hall was drowning in debt. Not the manageable debt that her father had always assured her family was normal for plantation operations, but catastrophic debt that compounded month after month with merciless interest. Her father had borrowed heavily to expand the cotton acreage 3 years earlier, gambling that rising prices would allow him to repay the loans quickly. Instead, prices had fallen. Then had come the expense of the funerals, the settlement of the estate, the legal fees. The numbers marched down the pages in neat columns, painting a picture of inevitable collapse. But it was the entries from the past 6 months that truly terrified her. The numbers no longer made sense. Income appeared and disappeared. Cotton that should have been sold at market showed no corresponding payment. Expenses ballooned without explanation. Either her father had lost his mind in his final months, or someone was stealing from the plantation on a massive scale. Catherine suspected the latter, and she suspected she knew who. She confronted Garrett on a Tuesday morning in early July, calling him into the study with as much authority as she could muster. She asked him to explain the discrepancies. She watched his face carefully as she pointed to specific entries, noting how his expression shifted from confusion to irritation to something that looked very much like contempt. He told her she was mistaken. The books were complicated. Women were not trained to understand such matters. Perhaps she should hire a proper accountant from the city to review everything and set her mind at ease. He could recommend someone. A friend of his, very trustworthy. Catherine dismissed him. She knew what he was doing. Bring in his own man. Someone who would help him cover his tracks and probably join in the theft. She needed help, but not from anyone connected to Garrett. She needed someone who could untangle the web of false entries and fraudulent accounts. Someone who could reconstruct what had really happened to Ashford Hall's money. She needed an expert. But where could she find such a person? The reputable accountants in Savannah were all part of the same social circle as Judge Crowley and the other men who wanted to see her fail. If she hired one of them, word would spread within days that the Hartwell girl was in financial trouble. The creditors would descend like vultures. It was her housekeeper, an elderly free woman of color named Mariah, who gave her the answer she did not want to hear. Miss Catherine, if you need someone who can read those books better than any white gentleman in Georgia, you got one right here on this property. You just ain't never asked him for help because the law says you can't. The name she spoke was Solomon. Catherine had seen him, of course, on a plantation of 143 enslaved people. She could not claim to know all of them personally, but Solomon was different. He stood out. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean, with intelligent eyes that seemed to observe everything and reveal nothing. Her father had kept him in the main house, using him as a personal secretary of sorts, though such a role violated numerous statutes that forbade teaching enslaved people to read and write. But her father had never cared much for laws he found inconvenient, and Solomon's abilities had proven too useful to ignore. Catherine sent for him that evening. She waited in the study, her heart pounding, knowing that what she was about to do crossed a line she could never uncross. When he entered, he stood just inside the doorway, his posture carefully neutral, his eyes downcast in the expected posture of submission. "Mariah tells me you can read," Catherine said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Yes, mistress." "And write. And work with numbers." "Yes, mistress." "My father taught you." A pause. "Yes, mistress." Catherine gestured to the ledgers spread across the desk. "These books contain the financial records of this plantation. Someone has been falsifying the entries. Someone has been stealing from Ashford Hall for months, perhaps longer. I need to know who and how much. Can you determine that?" For the first time, Solomon raised his eyes to meet hers. What she saw there surprised her. Not fear or calculation, but a kind of weary recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. "Yes, mistress, I can determine that. But it will take time, and I will need access to all the records, including correspondence and bills of sale." "You'll have it." "How long?" 2 weeks, perhaps 3, depending on how sophisticated the fraud is. Catherine nodded. Then she added, in a lower voice, "If anyone asks, you are cleaning the study and organizing papers. Nothing more. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly, mistress." As Solomon gathered the first set of ledgers and prepared to leave, Catherine spoke again, unable to stop herself from asking the question that had been gnawing at her since Mariah first spoke his name. "Why did my father teach you to read?" "It's illegal. He could have been fined, even arrested if the wrong person found out." Solomon paused at the door. When he answered, his voice carried an edge that made Catherine's breath catch. "Your father taught me to read, mistress, because he discovered that an enslaved man who can keep perfect records, who can forge documents when needed, and who can never testify against his owner in a court of law, is far more valuable than any white clerk who might develop a conscience or a loose tongue." He left before Catherine could respond. She sat alone in the study, staring at the empty doorway, and realized with a sinking sensation that she had just stepped into a game far more dangerous than she had imagined. Solomon worked at night. Catherine would retire to her chambers after dinner, dismissing the household staff, then slip back down to the study through the servants' passage. She would find him there, bent over the ledgers by lamplight, his long fingers moving across the pages with practiced precision. At first, they barely spoke. Solomon would present his findings in terse, clinical language, pointing to specific entries that did not match corresponding documents, identifying patterns of systematic theft. Catherine would listen, her anger growing with each revelation. Garrett had been embezzling for at least 2 years, possibly longer. He had help, probably from one of the merchants in Savannah who handled the cotton sales. Together, they had siphoned off thousands of dollars while her father, distracted by illness and family tragedy, failed to notice. But as the nights passed and the scope of the fraud became clear, something shifted between them. The forced formality began to crack. Solomon stopped calling her mistress quite so often. Catherine started asking him questions that had nothing to do with ledgers or accounting, curious about this man who possessed knowledge that most free men would envy. She learned that he had been born on a plantation in Virginia, sold south when he was 10 years old after his mother tried to escape. She learned that he had taught himself to read by studying the Bible that the plantation chaplain left lying around, memorizing passages until he could decode the patterns of letters and sounds. She learned that her father had discovered his abilities by accident when Solomon was caught writing a pass for another enslaved man, and instead of punishing him, her father had recognized the opportunity. Solomon asked questions too, carefully at first, testing the boundaries of what he could say. He asked about her education, about the books she read, about her plans for Ashford Hall once the fraud was exposed. He asked if she truly believed she could run a plantation when every man in Savannah was waiting for her to fail. "I don't know," Catherine admitted one night, the words escaping before she could stop them. "I don't know if I can do this. But I know I will not let Garrett and his accomplices destroy what my family built. I will not give Judge Crowley the satisfaction of buying this place for a fraction of its worth." Solomon looked up from the ledger he was examining. "And what about the people who work this land? What about the 143 human beings whose labor built everything your family owns? What happens to them when you save Ashford Hall?" The question hung in the air between them, dangerous and unanswerable. Catherine felt something twist in her chest, a combination of anger and shame and a terrible, unwelcome recognition. She had been thinking of the enslaved workers as assets, as property to be protected along with the land and the house. Solomon was forcing her to see them as something else entirely. "I don't know," she said again more quietly. "The law does not give me many choices." "The law," Solomon said, his voice carefully neutral, "was written by men who benefit from maintaining it. But you asked me to help you break the law by reading these books and keeping your secrets. Perhaps there are other laws worth breaking as well." He returned to his work before Catherine could respond, but the words lodged in her mind like a splinter, painful and impossible to ignore. The breakthrough came on a humid night in mid-August. Solomon had been working for 3 weeks, reconstructing the true financial picture of Ashford Hall from fragments and cross-references. Catherine had been pacing the study, too anxious to sit still, when Solomon suddenly sat back in his chair and released a long breath. "I have it," he said. "All of it. The amounts, the methods, the false accounts. More importantly, I know how to prove it." He explained his findings with the precise language of a trained accountant. Garrett had been creating phantom expenses, recording purchases that were never made and pocketing the difference. He had been underreporting cotton yields, selling the extra bales through a merchant named Whitmore, who then split the proceeds. Together, they had stolen nearly $18,000 over the past 2 years. But the evidence Solomon had compiled went beyond mere accounting. He had found copies of correspondence between Garrett and Whitmore, carelessly left in a file of old bills. He had discovered a second set of books that Garrett kept hidden in the overseer's cottage, books that recorded the real numbers. Most damning of all, he had traced specific cotton bales using the unique marking system that Ashford Hall employed, proving that bales reported as damaged or lost had actually been sold. "This is enough," Catherine breathed. "This is enough to have Garrett arrested, to recover the money through the courts." Solomon shook his head. "It would be, if you were a man. But you are not. And the evidence was compiled by an enslaved man who is forbidden by law from testifying against a white person. No court in Georgia will accept what I have found." Catherine felt the victory turn to ashes in her mouth. "Then what good is any of this? I know the truth, but I cannot prove it." "You cannot prove it in a court of law," Solomon corrected. "But there are other forms of proof, other kinds of justice." He explained his plan with the same careful precision he had used to unravel the fraud. They would not go to the courts. Instead, they would go directly to the merchants and creditors to whom Ashford Hall owed money. Solomon would create a complete accounting of the plantation's true financial position, demonstrating that the debts could be paid if the stolen money was recovered. Catherine would present this to a carefully selected group of creditors, people who stood to lose money if Ashford Hall collapsed entirely. She would offer them a choice: help her remove Garrett and recover the funds, or watch the plantation fail and lose everything they were owed. As for Garrett himself, they would give him a different choice. Leave Savannah immediately and never return, or face exposure and arrest. The evidence might not hold up in court, but it would certainly hold up in the court of public opinion. No plantation owner in the South would hire an overseer suspected of embezzlement. It was blackmail, pure and simple. It was also brilliant. Catherine looked at Solomon with new eyes, seeing not an enslaved man following orders, but a strategist, a tactician, someone who understood power and how to wield it even from a position of absolute powerlessness. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You could have used this information to bargain for your own freedom. You could have gone to Garrett and offered to hide the evidence in exchange for money or a forged free pass. Why risk everything to help me?" Solomon met her gaze steadily. "Because Garrett will sell me the moment he feels secure enough to do so. I have seen the documents. He has already been in contact with traders, inquiring about prices for a literate house servant. If I help him, I am dead or gone within 6 months. If I help you, I have a chance. A chance at what? At survival. At freedom. At life as something more than property." He paused. "You asked me earlier what happens to the people who work this land when you save Ashford Hall. I am asking you now to make me a promise. If this plan succeeds, if we recover the money and secure the plantation, you will grant me my freedom. Legal manumission, properly documented and filed with the state. That is my price for helping you." Catherine's heart raced. What Solomon was asking was not illegal exactly, but it was highly unusual and would raise questions. Manumitting an enslaved person required approval from the state legislature, along with proof that the freed person would not become a burden on society. The process could take months and cost hundreds of dollars in legal fees. But more than that, it would mark her as someone willing to undermine the institution of slavery itself. In Savannah society in 1858, with tensions rising and talk of secession growing louder by the day, that was a dangerous reputation to acquire. Yet what choice did she have? Solomon held all the cards. Without his evidence and his plan, she would lose everything. With his help, she might save Ashford Hall and prove that she was capable of running it alone. "If we succeed," Catherine said slowly, "I will grant you your freedom. You have my word." Solomon extended his hand across the desk. For a moment, Catherine stared at it, shocked by the presumption. Enslaved people did not shake hands with their owners. It violated every social custom, every rule of proper conduct. Then she reached out and grasped his hand firmly, sealing their bargain. The alliance between the heiress and the hidden ledger was complete. Now came the dangerous work of implementing their plan. Catherine began with the creditors, just as Solomon had advised. She invited them to Ashford Hall one by one, presenting each with a carefully edited version of the plantation's accounts. Solomon had coached her on what to say, how to frame the conversation to emphasize their mutual interests. She explained that she had discovered irregularities in the books, that she believed money had been stolen, and that she was taking steps to recover it. She showed them enough evidence to convince them she was serious, but not so much that they could act independently. The response was mixed. Some of the creditors were sympathetic, understanding that a successful recovery would benefit everyone. Others were skeptical, doubting that a woman could manage such a complex situation. But all of them agreed to wait before taking legal action, giving Catherine time to resolve the matter privately. Judge Crowley, however, was a different matter entirely. Catherine had not planned to approach him directly. He was not one of Ashford Hall's major creditors, though he held a note for a few $1,000s. But word of her private meetings had spread through Savannah's tight social circles, and the judge took it upon himself to pay Catherine a visit. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late August, his carriage pulling up to the front entrance with the presumption of someone who expected to be welcomed. Catherine received him in the parlor, her stomach tight with apprehension. Solomon had warned her that the judge would be a problem, that men like him saw any attempt by a woman to assert independence as a personal affront. The judge wasted no time with pleasantries. He had heard disturbing rumors, he said. Talk of financial troubles, of accusations against Mr. Garrett. He wanted to know if there was any truth to these stories. Catherine chose her words carefully. She acknowledged that there had been some irregularities in the accounts, but assured him that the matter was being handled. There was no cause for alarm. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. "Miss Hartwell, I am going to speak to you plainly, as your father would have wanted. You are in over your head. This situation, whatever it truly is, requires the attention of men who understand business and the law. I am prepared to renew my offer to purchase Ashford Hall. The price will be lower than before, given the circumstances, but it will free you from this burden. I am not selling, Catherine said firmly. Then you are a fool. The judge's voice turned cold. I know more about your situation than you realize, Miss Hartwell. I know your debts exceed your assets. I know that without a miracle crop this year, you will be bankrupt by spring. And I know that you have been conducting secret meetings late at night in your study with one of your father's slaves. Catherine felt the blood drain from her face. I don't know what you're suggesting, but I am suggesting nothing. I am stating facts. The judge stood, looming over her. You are playing a dangerous game, Miss Hartwell. A game you cannot win. If you persist in this foolishness, if you attempt to make accusations against respectable men like Mr. Garrett without proof that would stand up in court, you will find yourself ruined. Not just financially, but socially. The stories that will circulate about what you have been doing alone at night with an educated Negro will destroy whatever reputation you have left. He left without waiting for a response. Catherine remained in the parlor, her hands shaking, understanding the full scope of the threat. The judge was not just trying to buy Ashford Hall cheaply. He was protecting Garrett, probably because he was part of the scheme himself. And he was willing to use the most vicious weapon available in Southern society, the insinuation of sexual impropriety between a white woman and an enslaved black man. If he spread such rumors, it would not matter whether they were true. Catherine would be branded as degraded, possibly insane. No one would do business with her. The creditors would demand immediate payment. Ashford Hall would be sold at auction, probably to the judge himself, and Catherine would be lucky to escape to some distant city with any money at all. As for Solomon, his fate would be far worse. Even the suggestion that he had been intimate with a white woman could result in his being lynched, no trial necessary. Catherine found Solomon in the study that night and told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral, though she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders. We have to move faster, he said when she finished. The judge is trying to force your hand before you can implement the plan. If we wait, he will manufacture evidence to support his accusations. We need to strike now. How? We need more time to approach all the creditors, to build support. We do not need all the creditors. We need one. Solomon pulled out a list of names, pointing to a specific entry. Marcus Bellwether. He is your largest creditor, holding notes worth over $12,000. He is also honest, which makes him unusual in this city. If we can convince him to support you, the others will follow. They will not want to be on the opposite side of Bellwether when the truth comes out. Catherine knew the name. Bellwether was a cotton factor, one of the wealthiest men in Savannah. Her father had dealt with him for years, but she had never met him personally, and the thought of approaching him with such a wild story made her ill. He will never believe me, she said. I am exactly what the judge said, a young woman in over her head, making accusations I cannot prove. He will believe the evidence, Solomon corrected. I will create a document that lays out the entire fraud in detail, with references to specific transactions that Bellwether can verify independently. You will present it to him as your father's work, discovered after his death. You will tell him that your father suspected Garrett, but died before he could act. That makes it respectable, masculine, trustworthy. You want me to lie to him? I want you to survive. Solomon's voice was hard. The truth, Miss Hartwell, is that I am forbidden by law from testifying about what I know. The truth is that my evidence, no matter how solid, is legally meaningless because I am property. So yes, I want you to lie. I want you to take my work and claim it as your father's, because that is the only way to make it matter in this world. Catherine felt the weight of what he was asking. It was not just a lie, it was an erasure. Solomon had spent weeks reconstructing the fraud, demonstrating skills that would make him a valuable accountant in any city in America. But his name could never be attached to that work. His intelligence had to remain invisible, credited to a dead white man, or it would be worthless. I am sorry, she said quietly. I am sorry that this is necessary. Solomon met her eyes. So am I. But regret does not change reality. Now, we have work to do. They spent the night preparing the document. Solomon wrote in a careful imitation of her father's handwriting, copying passages from old letters to perfect the style. Catherine watched him work, marveling at his precision, at the care he took with each forged word. By dawn, they had created a 20-page report that detailed every theft, every false entry, every laundered transaction. It was a masterpiece of forensic accounting, and it bore the signature of William Hartwell, deceased. Catherine requested a meeting with Marcus Bellwether later that day. To her surprise, he agreed to see her immediately. She arrived at his office in the commercial district at noon, carrying the document in a leather case, her heart hammering so hard she was certain he would hear it. Bellwether was a man in his 60s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with the weathered face of someone who had built his fortune through hard work and careful judgment. He received Catherine with formal courtesy, offering her a chair in his spacious office overlooking the Savannah River. She explained the situation as Solomon had instructed, presenting the discovery of her father's document as the key to everything. She watched Bellwether's face as he read, trying to gauge his reaction. For long minutes, he said nothing, simply turning pages with increasing attention. Finally, he set the document down and looked at Catherine with an expression she could not quite read. "This is extraordinary work," he said. "Your father was more talented than I realized. The level of detail, the cross-referencing with external records, it is the work of a master accountant." Catherine felt her throat tighten. "My father was thorough in all things." "Indeed." Bellwether tapped the document thoughtfully. "Tell me, Miss Hartwell, did your father keep a personal secretary? Someone who might have assisted him with this research?" The question felt like a trap. Catherine chose her words carefully. "My father preferred to work alone on sensitive matters." "Of course." Bellwether's gaze was steady, knowing. "Miss Hartwell, I am going to be frank with you. This document proves beyond any doubt that you have been defrauded. If you take this to the authorities, you will win. Garrett will be arrested, Whitmore will be ruined, and the money will be recovered. But there will be questions. Questions about how this research was conducted, about who had access to the kind of records and correspondence that would make such a report possible. Judge Crowley will make certain those questions are asked very loudly." Catherine felt despair wash over her. Even with the evidence, even with Bellwether's support, she could not escape the trap the judge had set. But Bellwether was not finished. "However, I have a proposal. I will publicly endorse your account of events. I will use my influence to pressure Garrett and Whitmore to leave Savannah and make restitution. I will convince the other creditors that you are capable of managing Ashford Hall successfully. In return, you will accept my direct oversight of the plantation's finances for the next 2 years. I will assign one of my own accountants to work with you, ensuring that the books are kept properly and the debts are repaid on schedule." It was a lifeline, but it came with strings. Catherine would avoid scandal and ruin, but she would not be truly independent. Bellwether's man would be watching her, reporting back, ensuring she followed proper procedures. Yet what choice did she have? "I accept your terms," Catherine said. Bellwether nodded, satisfied. "Good. I will begin making arrangements immediately. Within the week, Mr. Garrett will depart for parts unknown, and Mr. Whitmore will find his services no longer required in Savannah. You will have your plantation back, Miss Hartwell, though I suspect you will discover that running it successfully is far more difficult than saving it." As Catherine rose to leave, Bellwether spoke again, his voice lower. "One more thing, Miss Hartwell. If your father did have help with this research, if there is someone on your property who possesses unusual skills, I would advise you to consider their future carefully. Talented people are rare. They should not be wasted." Catherine met his eyes and saw understanding there. Bellwether knew, or at least suspected. But he was giving her a way out, a chance to protect Solomon while maintaining the fiction that made everything legal. "I will keep that in mind," she said. The trap closed with brutal efficiency. Within 3 days of Catherine's meeting with Bellwether, Garrett received a visit from 3 of Savannah's most prominent merchants, men who controlled enough business that their displeasure could end a career. They presented him with a choice: leave Georgia immediately with whatever money he had already stolen, or face prosecution and certain prison time. Garrett took the offer. He departed on a Wednesday morning, his belongings hastily packed, his face white with rage and fear. Catherine watched from the window of her study as his wagon rolled down the lane, carrying him toward whatever uncertain future awaited men who had been exposed as thieves. Whitmore followed a day later, his cotton factoring business dissolved, his reputation destroyed. The word spread through Savannah that he had been involved in fraudulent dealings and could no longer be trusted. No one asked for details. In the tight world of Southern commerce, such whispers were enough. Catherine had won. Ashford Hall was saved. The creditors agreed to extend her payment schedules, confident that Bellwether's oversight would ensure the debts were honored. The cotton crop that fall was abundant, bringing in enough money to make substantial progress on the most pressing obligations. By winter, Catherine had established herself as a capable, if unconventional, plantation owner. But the victory felt hollow, because Catherine knew she had to keep her promise to Solomon. Manumitting an enslaved person in Georgia in 1858 was a complex legal process, made deliberately difficult to discourage the practice. Catherine filed the necessary petitions with the state legislature, arguing that Solomon had provided extraordinary service to the Hartwell family and deserved his freedom. She provided documentation of his good character, letters of support from Bellwether, and other respectable citizens who could attest to his value. The process took 6 months. 6 months during which Solomon continued to work in the study, now openly acknowledged as Catherine's accountant and advisor. Bellwether's man had been shocked to discover an enslaved person keeping the books with such skill, but Bellwether himself had simply instructed his employee to work with Solomon and learn what he could. The fiction was maintained that Solomon was merely implementing Catherine's decisions, but everyone who saw him work understood the truth. The permission for manumission finally arrived in March of 1859. Solomon was granted his freedom, with the caveat that he had to leave Georgia within 30 days and never return. It was a standard condition, designed to prevent free blacks from remaining in slave states and potentially encouraging rebellion. Catherine helped him prepare for his departure. She paid him a year's wages for his work, enough money to establish himself in a northern city. She wrote letters of introduction to business contacts in Philadelphia and New York, carefully worded to commend his skills without revealing the full extent of his knowledge. She gave him copies of the ledgers he had so painstakingly reconstructed, proof of his abilities should anyone question them. On his last night at Ashford Hall, they sat together in the study one final time. The room was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the distant sound of singing from the quarters, where the enslaved workers gathered in the evenings to find what comfort they could in community and faith. "I do not know how to thank you," Catherine said. "You saved me. You saved Ashford Hall." Solomon shook his head. "I saved myself. You were simply the means." "That is not true. You could have escaped months ago with Garrett's money. You could have betrayed me to the judge. You had options." "I had survival strategies," Solomon corrected. "That is different from having options. Options are what free people have." Catherine felt the rebuke in his words. "Will you tell me where you are going? Can I write to you?" "No." Solomon's voice was firm. "For your sake as much as mine. If anyone discovers that you maintain correspondence with a freed Negro, it will be used against you. You have fought too hard to establish your position here. Do not jeopardize it for sentiment. Is that all this was to you? Survival strategy and nothing more?" Solomon was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost gentle. "What do you want me to say, Miss Hartwell? That these months meant something? That working beside you, speaking freely with you, being treated as something more than property created a bond between us? Of course it did. But that does not change reality. You are a white woman who owns a plantation built on the labor of enslaved people. I am a black man whose freedom is granted by your grace and depends on my leaving immediately. There is no future where those facts do not matter. I could free more people," Catherine said suddenly. "I could start manumitting others, one by one. It would take time, but— and how would you pay your debts without their labor? How would you maintain Ashford Hall? How would you live?" Solomon's expression was sad but unyielding. "You are trapped in this system just as surely as I was, Miss Hartwell. The difference is that your cage is gilded and comfortable, while mine was iron and cruel. But we are both prisoners of the same institution. My freedom does not change that. It only means I escape while you remain." Catherine felt tears burning her eyes. "I do not want this. I do not want to be a slave owner. But I do not know how to be anything else and survive." "Then you must live with that contradiction," Solomon said. "You must make whatever peace you can with the knowledge that your prosperity requires other people's bondage. That is the burden of your position, Miss Hartwell. That is the price of being a Hartwell daughter." He stood to leave, and Catherine rose with him. For a moment, They faced each other across the desk that had been the site of their collaboration, their conspiracy, their strange and forbidden partnership. "I will not forget you," Catherine said. "Good," Solomon replied. "Do not forget any of this. Do not forget what you learned about yourself, about this world, about what you are capable of when you must be. And do not forget that there are 142 people still living in bondage on this plantation, people with minds and souls and dreams just as real as mine. If you must continue this life, at least see them. At least acknowledge what their servitude costs." He left before Catherine could respond. The next morning, she watched from the same window where she had observed Garrett's departure as Solomon walked down the lane, a free man heading north toward an uncertain future. He did not look back. Catherine stood at the window long after he disappeared from sight. Behind her, the ledgers lay open on the desk, filled with columns of numbers that represented lives and labor and wealth built on suffering. Before her, the fields of Ashford Hall stretched toward the horizon, worked by people who would never see freedom as Solomon had. She had saved the plantation. She had proven herself capable. She had survived. But she would spend the rest of her life wondering if survival had been worth the cost. Spring turned to summer, and Ashford Hall prospered under Catherine's management. The cotton grew tall and healthy. The debts shrank month by month. Bellwether's accountant filed regular reports praising her business acumen and attention to detail. Catherine Hartwell had become, against all odds and expectations, a successful plantation owner. But success brought no peace. She could not forget Solomon's final words. They echoed in her mind as she walked the fields, as she reviewed the ledgers, as she lay awake at night in the too-large house that seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing day. She found herself watching the enslaved workers with new eyes, seeing not units of labor, but individual human beings trapped in a system that denied their humanity. There was Patience, who sang while she worked in the kitchen, her voice carrying melodies that spoke of sorrow and endurance. There was Daniel, whose hands moved with the precision of an artist as he repaired tools and machinery, skills that in a just world would have made him a wealthy craftsman. There was Ruth, who tended the sick in the quarters with knowledge passed down through generations, a healer who would never be acknowledged as such by white society. Catherine saw them now, and seeing them made everything harder. Judge Crowley had not forgiven her victory. He watched from a distance, waiting for her to make a mistake, spreading subtle rumors that questioned her character and competence. The fact that she had succeeded where he predicted failure only deepened his resentment. He made it known in social circles that Catherine Hartwell was a dangerous aberration, a woman who had overstepped her proper place and would eventually face consequences for her presumption. The warning came in September, delivered by Mariah in the quiet hours after dinner. Word had reached her through the network of enslaved and free black people who communicated beneath the notice of white society. Judge Crowley was asking questions about Solomon. He wanted to know where the freed Negro had gone, what skills he possessed, how he had come to be manumitted. He was building a case, gathering evidence to prove that Catherine had violated laws regarding the education of enslaved people. If he succeeded, the consequences would be severe. Catherine could face heavy fines, possibly imprisonment. Ashford Hall could be seized by the state, and every enslaved person on the property would be sold at auction to pay the penalties. Catherine understood the message. Judge Crowley was telling her that her victory was temporary, that he could destroy her whenever he chose. He was giving her one final chance to submit, to sell him the plantation at the price he named, to accept her proper place as a subordinate requiring male protection and guidance. She called an emergency meeting with Bellwether. The older man listened to her concerns with his characteristic calm attention, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he considered the problem. "The judge is desperate," Bellwether said finally. "He has lost face, lost money, and lost influence because of your success. Desperate men make mistakes. The question is whether we can force him to make one fatal enough to end his campaign against you. What do you suggest?" Bellwether smiled, a cold expression that reminded Catherine that he had not built his fortune through kindness. "The judge has many business interests, Miss Hartwell. Some of them are questionable. Some are outright illegal. If someone were to investigate his affairs with the same thoroughness that your father's research displayed, I suspect we would find material sufficient to occupy his attention for a very long time." Catherine understood immediately. "You want to threaten him the way he is threatening me." I prefer to think of it as establishing mutual deterrence. The judge will understand that any attempt to expose your alleged violations will result in the exposure of his actual violations. Intelligent men, faced with such circumstances, generally choose to maintain a tense peace rather than risk mutual destruction. It was blackmail again, the same strategy that had worked against Garrett and Whitmore. Catherine should have been shocked, horrified at how easily she was accepting such tactics. Instead, she felt only a weary recognition. This was how power worked in the world she inhabited. This was the game she had chosen to play when she decided to save Ashford Hall. "Do you have evidence against him?" she asked. "Not yet, but evidence can be obtained. I have contacts, people who ask questions discreetly. Give me 2 weeks." Catherine nodded her agreement, sealing another bargain that compromised her principles in service of survival. The 2 weeks passed with agonizing slowness. Catherine maintained her normal routines, managing the plantation, reviewing accounts, projecting confidence she did not feel. But at night, alone in her chambers, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth that she had been avoiding for months. She hated this life. She hated the necessity of holding human beings in bondage. She hated the constant political maneuvering required to maintain her position. She hated the isolation of being a woman in a man's role, respected for her competence, but never truly accepted. She hated the weight of knowing that her prosperity depended on the suffering of others. But what alternative did she have? She could not simply free everyone and abandon the plantation. The law would not allow it. The creditors would seize the property. The formerly enslaved people would have nowhere to go, no means of support, and would likely be recaptured and sold to far crueler owners. Her gesture of conscience would accomplish nothing except her own ruin and their greater suffering. She was trapped, just as Solomon had said, trapped in a system that offered no good choices, only degrees of compromise and complicity. Bellwether returned at the end of the 2 weeks with a thick folder of documents. He presented his findings to Catherine in the privacy of her study, and what she learned made her blood run cold. Judge Crowley was involved in the illegal slave trade, not the domestic trade, which was legal if morally repugnant, but the international trade, which had been banned by federal law since 1808. He had been secretly investing in ships that smuggled captured Africans into the United States through isolated coastal areas, selling them to plantation owners who were willing to pay premium prices for workers who could never be traced through legal channels. It was one of the most serious crimes in the federal legal code, punishable by death in some circumstances. If the evidence became public, Judge Crowley would face not just financial ruin, but execution. "How did you obtain this information?" Catherine asked, her voice shaking. "That is not important," Bellwether replied. "What matters is that it is accurate and can be verified. The question is what you intend to do with it." Catherine stared at the documents, understanding the terrible power they represented. She could destroy Judge Crowley completely. She could send him to the gallows for his crimes. She could eliminate the threat he posed to her forever. But she could also use the information exactly as Bellwether suggested, as a deterrent, a guarantee of peace through the threat of mutual destruction. She could maintain the uneasy balance that allowed her to continue running Ashford Hall without constant attacks on her position. The moral choice seemed clear. A man engaged in the illegal slave trade deserved to face justice. Allowing him to escape consequences for such evil was its own form of complicity. But Catherine had learned something in the months since her father's death. She had learned that moral clarity was a luxury she could no longer afford. The world she inhabited did not reward virtue. It rewarded power and the willingness to use it. "Arrange a meeting with the judge," she said quietly. "Private, confidential. Tell him I have a business proposition." Bellwether nodded, neither approving nor disapproving. He simply gathered the documents and departed, leaving Catherine alone with her decision. The meeting took place 3 days later in a rented room at one of Savannah's better hotels. Catherine arrived with Bellwether. Judge Crowley came alone, his expression conveying contempt and impatience. He clearly expected this to be Catherine's surrender, her final acceptance that she could not win against him. Catherine allowed him to maintain that belief for exactly 2 minutes. Then she placed the folder on the table between them and watched his face as he opened it. The transformation was remarkable. The judge's arrogance drained away as he read, replaced by shock, then fear, then a cold, calculating awareness. He looked up at Catherine with new eyes, seeing her not as an impudent girl, but as a genuine threat. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "That does not matter," Catherine replied, using Bellwether's words. "What matters is that it is accurate. What matters is that it can be verified. What matters is that I now possess the power to destroy you as completely as you threatened to destroy me. You would not dare. You are a woman. You depend on the good opinion of Savannah society. If you expose these documents, questions will be asked about how you obtained them. Your own reputation will be shredded." "Perhaps," Catherine acknowledged. "But I will survive with my reputation damaged." "You will not survive at all. The federal government takes violations of the slave trade prohibition very seriously, Judge Crowley. Men have been hanged for less than what these documents prove." The silence stretched between them, thick with threat and calculation. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "What do you want?" "I want peace," Catherine said simply. "I want you to stop investigating Solomon's manumission. I want you to stop spreading rumors about my management of Ashford Hall. I want you to cease all efforts to undermine my position in Savannah society. In return, these documents will remain private. You can continue your various business enterprises without interference from me. You are asking me to accept defeat. I am offering you survival. That is more generous than you deserve." Judge Crowley's hands clenched on the table. For a moment, Catherine thought he might refuse, might choose to gamble that she would not actually expose him. But Bellwether's presence beside her, silent and implacable, reminded the judge that Catherine was not acting alone. She had powerful allies who would ensure the documents reached the proper authorities if necessary. "Very well," the judge said finally. "You have your peace, Miss Hartwell. But understand this. You have made a permanent enemy today. I will never forgive this humiliation. And if you ever make a mistake, if you ever give me an opening, I will destroy you with pleasure." "I understand completely," Catherine replied. "Now get out." The judge left, his dignity in tatters, his power over Catherine broken. Bellwether allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. "You did well," he said. "You have secured your position. Ashford Hall is safe." Catherine did not feel victorious. She felt exhausted, dirted by the entire transaction. She had blackmailed a man to protect herself, using evidence of his participation in one of the cruelest trades imaginable. She had chosen her own security over justice, chosen compromise over principle. She had become exactly what Solomon had described, a prisoner of the system, making whatever accommodations were necessary to survive within it. 2 years passed. Ashford Hall flourished. Catherine paid off the last of her major debts in the spring of 1861, just as the first shots of the Civil War were fired at Fort Sumter. The world she had fought so hard to preserve began to crack apart, torn by the fundamental contradiction at its heart, a nation founded on liberty that had built its prosperity on slavery. Catherine watched the disintegration with mixed feelings. Part of her felt a terrible vindication. The system that had trapped her, that had forced her into compromises and complicity, was finally facing its reckoning. But another part of her felt only dread at what the coming war would bring. She thought often of Solomon during those years. She wondered where he had gone, what life he had built in freedom. She wondered if he thought of her, if he judged her for the choices she had made. She wondered if he had been right when he said they were both prisoners, or if his freedom had proven him wrong. She would never know. Solomon had vanished into the north, leaving no trace, protecting himself by maintaining absolute silence. Catherine respected his choice even as she mourned the loss of the only person who had truly understood what she had endured. The enslaved people of Ashford Hall remained in bondage. Catherine treated them as well as the system allowed, providing adequate food and shelter, limiting physical punishment, allowing families to stay together. But she knew such kindness was inadequate compensation for the theft of their freedom. She knew that every day they spent in chains was a moral failure that no amount of managerial competence could absolve. When the war finally came to Georgia, when Sherman's army marched through the state burning plantations and liberating enslaved people, Catherine did not resist. She watched from the porch of Ashford Hall as blue-coated soldiers rode up the lane, as the people who had worked her fields for years gathered their few belongings and walked away as free men and women. She watched Patience and Daniel and Ruth and 139 others depart, their faces showing relief and joy and understandable wariness about what freedom would mean in a world still hostile to their existence. Ashford Hall was left empty, a monument to a system that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own evil. Catherine remained in the house alone, surrounded by the ledgers that chronicled 3 generations of wealth built on human suffering. She opened the oldest ledger, the one her grandfather had started when he first purchased the land. She traced the columns with her finger, seeing not just numbers, but names, lives, stories that would never be told. She thought about Solomon and the work he had done to save her, work that had required him to hide his brilliance, to attribute his genius to a dead white man, to remain invisible even as he shaped events. She thought about the price they had both paid for her survival. His freedom purchased with months of servitude in all but name. Her victory achieved through blackmail and compromise and the continued enslavement of everyone else on the property. They had both won, in their way. They had both survived. But survival was not the same as justice. Survival was not the same as redemption. Catherine closed the ledger and walked out of Ashford Hall for the last time. The house would stand empty for years, slowly decaying, a reminder of what the South had been and what it had cost to maintain that world. She would move to Charleston, live quietly on what remained of her money, and spend the rest of her life trying to atone for the compromises she had made. She would never know if it was enough. She would never know if any amount of regret could balance the scales for the years she had held people in bondage, even as she hated the system that required it. She would carry that uncertainty to her grave, along with the memory of a brilliant man who had saved her life and then vanished into freedom, leaving her to face the consequences of the world they had both navigated. The truth of the antebellum South was always more shocking than the fiction. It was a world where good people could commit terrible acts, where survival required complicity, where the only choices were between degrees of compromise. It was a world where even victory tasted like ashes, where even freedom came at an unbearable cost. This was the story of Catherine Hartwell and the man she knew as Solomon. This was the story of 2 brilliant people trapped in an evil system, fighting for survival in the only ways available to them. This was the story of what it cost to challenge that system, and what it cost to ultimately fail to overcome it. This was the story of the heiress and the hidden ledger. The truth of the antebellum South was always more shocking than the fiction. The stories of forbidden alliances, of impossible partnerships formed across the color line, of brilliant minds forced to hide their light. These stories existed in the shadows of history, documented in fragmentary records, whispered in family memories, lost to the deliberate erasure of time. Catherine Hartwell's story is one of thousands that unfolded in the decades before the Civil War, stories of women who inherited systems they did not create and had to navigate impossible choices. Solomon's story represents millions more, people of extraordinary talent forced to use their gifts in service of their own survival, their contributions stolen or hidden, their names forgotten. If this story of forbidden partnership and ultimate survival moved you, if it made you think about the complexity of history and the real people who lived through impossible circumstances, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps us uncover more of the forbidden history that the textbooks left out, the stories of ordinary people facing extraordinary moral challenges in America's darkest hours. Click the bell to ensure you don't miss the next dark secret. Because the past is never as simple as we were taught. The truth is always more complicated, more human, and more necessary to understand if we hope to build a better future. The ledgers of history are filled with names we will never know, stories we will never fully recover. But every story we can tell, every voice we can recover from the silence, brings us closer to understanding the full truth of who we were and who we can choose to become. This has been the Heiress and the Hidden Ledger. Thank you for listening.